Good afternoon. This is Josh Howard, the agronomist for TTG Equipment, and I want to thank you for participating in the 2020 TTG Equipment Virtual Fall Harvest Expo. In this presentation, we will talk a little bit about the importance of proper residue management in the fall and its importance as we look ahead to the following growing season. We will focus on the value of managing residue in the fall. Fall residue management starts with a harvesting pass. And when you think about it, the first moment that the front of the combine touches the crop, we are already starting to manage residue. Then, the last point at which the residue exits the combine, we are again managing residue with the combine's residue disposal system. Although the threshing process inside the combine box itself may have some residual effect on the condition of the plant material, when setting the combine for residue management itself, the 2 points we are most concerned about are at the head and then again at the rear of the combine. Getting the most out of the combine's residue processing components will help set us up for more successful fall tillage. So what's the biggest reason we are concerned with residue management during the harvest process? What's the biggest benefactor? It's because of the conditions we want to have for the next spring. And preparing for next spring starts with the harvesting process and continues through the completion of the fall field work. Although this picture might be stating the obvious, this is what we need to keep in mind as we work through our fall field processes. The situation in this photograph is certainly not ideal. We have too much residue near and in some cases on the row, and we have several pieces of residue that might be considered too large and many of which haven't been split or broken. And these pieces are certainly inhibiting the emergence process. When we think about residue management in the spring, the 6x6 rule comes to mind. This rule essentially states that clearing residue in a 6-inch path centered on the row at or before planting will often result in a 6% increase in yield. The 6x6 intersection at the graph on the right is the point that we see the best combination of return, and this is where the curve begins to flatten out, showing much less rate of yield gains as we move towards 30 inches of residue clearing. So, positioning ourselves where we can effectively move the residue away from the row in the spring is key. Again, what we do in the fall will certainly have an effect on what we can accomplish in the spring, and there are definitely financial benefits in doing a good, effective job. And it goes without saying that corn to corn continues to be a very challenging endeavor when it comes to residue management. Many of us have just come to think that corn to corn may never be perfect. We kind of temper our expectations, understanding that we battle with some stand reduction. We certainly have a discrepancy in nitrogen rates due to nitrogen immobilization, which basically means that the extra residue ties up a certain percentage of the available nitrogen that's in the soil or the nitrogen that we're applying to the soil. And we have a few other challenges such as increased hairpinning, which can result in pieces of residue getting vertically wedged down into the seed trench. That can bring in some seedling blights and have some issue with wicking moisture out. However, it seems like each year we do have more and more tools to continue to improve on that process, whether it be stock rolls, chopping heads, new and improved tillage tools. As an industry, we continue to make strides that definitely improve corn to corn situations each year. Okay, so let's summarize our goals here at this point where we're at here. Again, our ultimate goal, end goal, is for successful crop emergence in the following spring, right? Timely emergence, uniform emergence. So we strive for uniform trash disbursement over the entire field in the fall, with adequate residue sizing and degradation. And ultimately, this leads to reduced or even eliminated planter interference in the spring if we do things right with the planter. So in order to attain that spring situation, that ideal spring situation, our fall goals will include having residue in a manageable state, and in doing so, our fall tillage will perform much better when the harvesting pass is effective in handling and managing that residue. So this will ultimately set the stage for our spring goals listed above. However, another component that we might not talk about as much is the timely release of leftover stock nutrients. When you look into nutrient content of corn residue, the numbers can be quite surprising. And there are multiple sources when it comes to measuring these numbers. And for this example, I took some of the lowest numbers I could find in various points of research. But there should be approximately 1 ton of stover for every 40 bushels of corn raised on an acre. So in corn that yields 200 bushels per acre, we can expect upwards of 4 or maybe 5 tons per acre of corn stover to remain in the field. So I used some of the most conservative numbers I could find for stock N, P, and K concentrations and multiplied those numbers by 4.5, which would be halfway between 4 and 5 tons per acre of stover. So this gives us an expected, the amount of expected N, P, and K nutrients that would be tied up in that remaining residue after the grain is harvested from a corn crop. And when you use current fertilizer prices, which I also think are very conservative, you'll find that if you look, you can see the dollar value here is pretty eye-opening. When you look at the per acre value that we have in the field, and when you put that over 1,000 acres, that kind of puts it in perspective if you have 1,000 acres of corn. And I would like to think that most of us would like to gain access to those nutrients as quickly as possible. And in order to do that, we need to properly process that residue in the fall so that breakdown process can begin. Let's talk a little bit about where we are here and why we're able to see these numbers. And what are some of the other benefits? I think we can all agree with the fact that cropping practices have kind of been changing over the last 15 years and are still doing so. And we are still pushing corn populations quite a bit higher. And we continue to push yield barriers as well, where some of us have set new field highs just within the last couple of years. And if you do a little math, you can easily see in some cases we've been able to achieve a 20% yield increase with merely a 10% population increase. So that I think maybe most of us would fit into that category anyway if you kind of do the math. So I guess that leads to the question that I want to ask here is that are plants becoming more efficient in their fertilizer uptake and usage? Most universities will say that's definitely the case, and I think I tend to agree with that up to a certain point. Part of that efficiency, that increase in plant efficiency comes from the fact that we are gaining yield at a faster rate than we are adding plants, so we are indeed having to feed less stalks for the amount of grain that we're harvesting on a percentage basis. And it's not uncommon to outpace our yield goals from time to time. We may set a solid yield goal, let's say 200 bushels per acre, and when the season ends, maybe we've exceeded that goal. Let's say we actually made 220 bushels per acre, and that's a victory, right? We call that a victory. That's a success that we want to measure and want to find out what we did right. So where does that extra yield come from? Some of it may be genetics, some of it may come from the increase in additions of seed and fertilizer that we've talked about. Oftentimes it's weather or weather events that have given us that boost. And some of it comes from how we've learned to adapt our farming processes. Maybe we've improved on things. We go back to emergence and some of the equipment that we've been able to use to do a better job in general. But I also want to reiterate that even though we only have an increase of maybe 3,000 to 5,000 plants per acre when we've boosted these populations compared to 20 years ago, that's still quite a bit of stover that we are adding to a field, and thus a fair amount of fertilizer is sitting in that stover. So it's safe to assume that even though plants are becoming more and maybe they're becoming more efficient, we are also adding back more fertilizer into the soil that we maybe hadn't thought about before. So I'm of the belief that part of that efficiency in our yield increases could well come from the fact that we are also adding more fertilizer back into the soil in the form of broken down corn stover that maybe we hadn't been adding in 10, 15 years ago. But we are certainly using what is available to us, right? We're going to use it if it's there. So it might be more than we realize, particularly in the short term, as we do a better job of breaking down these residues in a timely manner. So what about another issue we face here with too much unprocessed corn residue, and that's disease pressure, right? Stock tissue is a huge medium for corn disease pathogens. So the better job we do of destroying that stock tissue in that medium, the better job we are doing of reducing the amount of the places that these diseases and pathogens can hide and hang around. So we know that corn pathogens are mainly airborne as opposed to soil-borne, which like soybeans are soil-borne, often soil-borne diseases. So being that they're airborne, these diseases need that plant tissue to survive, particularly for overwinter. So, and again, if we don't manage our residue correctly, early disease pressure is always a possibility, particularly in corn-to-corn situations. We already talked about the hairpinning, the seedling blights that can happen there. So timely residue breakdown, again, is one way to help manage disease pressure. And we obviously want to disintegrate that medium as soon as possible, right, to avoid to avoid any unfortunate situations with disease as much as we can. And when you consider that fungicide applications can cost as much as $30 per acre, it definitely adds value to the processing that residue in the fall. It is definitely one tool. It's not the only tool, but it's one management tool that we can use to help reduce disease pressure. I want to talk very briefly about stock rolls here, and for more in-depth information on some newer stock rolls that we have available this year and their characteristics, I want to encourage you to watch the separate video that will be posted on the John Deere Romax stock rolls. I think that's a very informative, very short video, but definitely want to encourage you to watch that as well. And the purposes of stock rolls are generally twofold, right? We want to effectively pull down the stock to dislodge the ear, and then while doing that we want to kind of crimp or cut the stalk into manageable sizes while doing that. And again, the specifics of the size of stalk pieces are going to vary from customer to customer preference, right, depending on your tillage programs or what your preferences are, and I get that. So a lot of times you can size or pick your stalk roll configuration based on that situation. But we generally talk about two types of positioning when we talk about stalk rolls. We talk about opposed and intermeshing. Historically, opposed positioning has been recommended for a grower that generally harvests drier corn, and opposed positioning is often recommended with a chopping corn head, such as the John Deere Stockmaster corn head. And then intermeshing positioning has typically been recommended in those cases where maybe the stalk moisture is a bit higher, which is not uncommon for us, you know, in our area. If people have used fungicides, or if growers have a lot of corn acres to harvest and they're forced to go out and harvest a little bit wetter corn with wetter stalks. So again, for a more in-depth look at stalk rolls, please check out our short video on the Romax stalk rolls. I did mention this John Deere Stockmaster on the last slide, and this head configuration is a very effective option for sizing stock material. It's been pretty common in certain parts of our AOR, our area of responsibility, as TTG equipment. And again, we often refer to these configurations as chopping heads, and they perform exactly that, basically chopping up most of the residue that remains below the head during the gathering process. And you can kind of see from this picture, it's almost like a mower blade down there that's doing some chop work under the head. So again, a very effective tool in residue management. And then as far as the combine's residue disposal system, this is also a very important part of the residue management process of the combine. And depending on the combine configuration, the job of this residue disposal system has typically been to chop any large residue that remains from the separation process, and then that remains in the combine from the separation process, I should say, and then spread that material uniformly over the harvesting width. So there are many options and adjustments available as far as residue disposal systems, but we've had some pretty impressive technological advancements in this area over the past several years. And it was certainly an area that we needed improvement in. So they're very welcome advancements across the industry, particularly as our harvest widths have increased substantially. We've had a need to get that residue spread evenly, and definitely in no-till situations as well. That's as far as I'm going to go as far as the residue disposal systems. There's obviously a lot of, again, configurations and settings and things that we won't dive into right now, but for more information on any of these systems as far as combines go, please feel free to contact your TTG equipment salesperson for more information. This slide here is a good illustration of spring conditions following two different types of fall residue management systems. But these are both conventional tillage systems. In fact, both fields were ripped and then worked in the spring with recent model John Deere field cultivators. So on the left side of the photograph, I would consider that to be much more ideal. This residue was thoroughly managed during the fall harvest process. In fact, the field on the left side did have what we call a chopping corn head. And on the right side, there certainly could have been some more improvements in the fall residue management process. Even selecting maybe a more effective stalk roll would have made a pretty big difference on that right side of the field. So, and again, our goal is to have the most ideal situation in the spring, and it all starts in the fall. To briefly summarize and maybe simplify the residue management process, kind of how I look at it here, it begins when we begin to break apart the plant tissue and spread it uniformly across the field. And at that point, Mother Nature begins to help with the degradation process. We have a subsequent release of nutrients, and then over time, the organic material becomes part of the soil structure, right? It becomes organic matter. So And again, we start this process in the fall, and it starts with that first pass of the combine. The first time that combine touches that material at the front of the head, we begin to manage residue. And again, fall, normally at corn harvest, this is a time when we still have adequate temperatures in the soil, which means that that microbial process will still be active in the soil, and that plant material can begin to start being broken down by these microbes the minute that managed material hits the soil. So again, it all starts the combine, and it's a very important part of, from an agronomic standpoint, very important part of the cropping cycle, fall residue management. That is the end of this presentation on fall residue management, and I want to thank you for watching. And again, I want to encourage you to watch our videos on the John Deere stock roll options for 2020, highlighting the John Deere Romax stock rolls, and also please check out our agronomic video on fall tillage options as well. And I want to wish everybody a safe and healthy harvest in 2020.